Okay, so this is my research project or research project for my sexuality study. There we go. So for the introduction, in this project, I will review the results of the sexuality study. Um, it's in my methods and sample, but participants included UMass Global students. The purpose of this was to dissect and review the results achieved to better understand um, the information that I was able to gather from the survey that I conducted. And I would say that understanding the results will guide future research to better understand how to study sexuality, and also what steps could be taken in the future to better understand sexuality. And so for my first literature review, I found an article that attempted to define what sexuality was. It wound up being a meta-analysis, and so there was no particular sample that was set, no particular guidelines into um, the studies that were reviewed. Something that was of importance, though, was for this meta-analysis, um, when researchers were looking at past studies, they wanted to ensure that adults past the age of 65 were included in studies. It was found that a lot of studies that discuss sexuality tend to either focus on adolescents or young adults, as well as the kind of general adult age range. And a lot of times, individuals who are of 65 years or older kind of get left out in the findings. And so that was something that was considered. And so even though they looked at all different types of studies and research studies, um, anything that did not include people over the age of 65 were considered to be out of scope. And so for this meta-analysis, researchers looked at articles from 1995 to 2018. So that's kind of a very, very broad range. And again, the main thing was understanding how has sexuality been defined up until this point. This article was conducted in 2020, so up until that year. Um, Something that has been very common is the definition. Now, the definition of sexuality is constantly changing. It tends to be very inconsistent across individuals' lifespans. Something that's always brought up is depending on the background, the upbringing, societal or cultural factors, the definition of sexuality is constantly changing. It's kind of like a ever-changing line, a line that always shifts. And so for this particular study, what they concluded was that there was a dire need to have a greater consistency in what the actual definition of sexuality is. And then for my second review, again, trying to understand how do we define sexuality or sexual orientation. For this particular study, it aimed to utilize assessments and measurements to better understand the definition of sexual orientation, um, which was more focused in a clinical setting to provide better conceptualization of clients. For this particular research, they used specific scales. Some scales that were used were the Kinsey scale, the Klein orientation scale, self-report scales or self-report measures from clients, so kind of taking the client's word of like what they are telling the clinician, the attraction assessment inventory, and the romantic scales measure. Um, Again, for this one, which is becoming such a, or has become a common theme with all the research that I found, is over the course of time, the definition or the idea of sexuality or sexual orientation completely fluid, ever changing. There really isn't a particular spot on 100% definition for defining sexuality. And again, sexuality is so dependent on the individual's perception. And so one person might define sexuality as one thing, the next might define it as something completely opposite or completely different. And so for this particular study, what they were trying to gain a better understanding of is how are assessments utilized maybe more effectively to better understand sexuality. Something that they did discuss was that even though self-report tools are useful for clinicians in a clinical setting, so like one-on-one therapy, group therapy, um, it's not really beneficial for researchers who are trying to gain an understanding of the topic. And so even though measurement tools are of extreme value to clinicians, to researchers, it kind of falls flat. And then for the last study I did, same thing, just trying to understand and define what sexuality is. That tended to be the big, like, overarching theme of trying to figure out how to do this project. Um, what I liked about this article, even though it was really short and I couldn't really find anything outside of what I was able to in the library, even though they attempted to define sexuality, um, they were really focusing on understanding sexuality through life satisfaction and a socio-cultural viewpoint. Um, for this study, they ensured that they were talking to minority groups. And so I haven't looked at all of the research. I can't say specifically what is the individuals that are commonly targeted, but I did find that to be of utmost importance, I think, in research, typically speaking, especially depending on how old it is. Not a lot of minority groups are involved in research. And so I think this is a great kind of twist, or not twist, but a great leeway into understanding that there are other minority groups. And minority can be sexual, gender, ethnic, racial. It kind of encompasses everything. And so for this one, again, sexuality is this mix of social, psychological, biological, and cultural factors, and it's subjective to the individual. And so there is no specific set definition for what sexuality um, is or could be defined as. I think, in the grand scheme of things, when we think of sexuality or sexual orientation, like homosexual, bisexual, transgendered, I think people can put labels underneath those categories. But again, you talk to a specific individual and how they view sexuality, it's going to change, it's going to differ depending on who you're talking to. And so a conclusion to this study was to better understand sexuality from that biopsychosocial perspective. Maybe research should start looking at how people feel connected to their sexuality and what their level of life satisfaction is in regards to their identified sexuality. And so I kind of liked this article. It was a very different twist. And so, based on the research, we can gain an understanding that sexuality is essentially a spectrum that changes based on the individual. This can lead to gaining better understanding of how sexuality impacts individuals in a broader way. And so, instead of just looking at it from let's define sexuality, let's begin to uncover all the nuances that go into what sexuality is. And so, for my research question, I wanted to approach how do individuals perceive sexual orientation and gender identity, and how do these perceptions influence their overall well-being and sense of self? So for my population and my sample, for my survey, there were 13 individuals from UMass Global, all ranging from the ages of 18 to 25, 26 to 33, 34 to 41, 42 to 49, and 50 and older. A good majority of my research participants, as far as their age range, were about 18 to 25 and 34 to 41. And so it was kind of even throughout, but that was the main bulk of my sample. As well as the main bulk of my sample was 46.2% Caucasian. Um, that was the main bulk. And then the second main bulk of my survey was 38.5% identified as Hispanic, Latino, or Latina. Um, and so between Caucasian individuals and Hispanic, Latinx individuals, that was a big majority of my sample, as well as a big majority of my sample was about 84.6% female. And so that showcases to me that the findings are definitely more understood through a female identified perspective when I look at like my results. And for my survey, about 61.6%, that was the main bulk of my sample, identified as heterosexual or straight. Less than half of that identified as homosexual, either gay or lesbian. Less than half that identified as pansexual. And then 7.7% did not identify with any particular sexual orientation. I'm not sure if they didn't answer the question or maybe they overlooked it. And so I really would like to see where that 7.7% would go to. But something I find interesting is because 61.6% of my sample was heterosexual, I think that could skew my results into understanding like overall life satisfaction, especially looking at like a societal norm of someone who identifies as straight, as heterosexual. There's not a lot of stigma or discrimination attached to that. And so when I get into my results section, I'll be able to break that down a little bit more. For my method, it was a survey via Google Docs. I had about 29 questions. I believe, I'm going to say 5 of them were just basic demographic demographic information. So about 24 of those questions were actually the survey questions. And the questions were aimed to gather data on individuals' feelings about sexuality and their comfortability with their sexuality, and also understanding sexuality from a societal perspective, and how people feel about their respective sexual identities. Ooh. And so for the results, a bunch of graphs here. This was the identified attraction. And so I have quite a few more slides for this, but what's your visual attraction to men? What's your sexual attraction to men? What's your visual attraction to women? What's your sexual attraction to women? And so kind of the jumping off point for me was understanding that even though someone can identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, or transgendered, I mean, um, um, I forgot the other last one, but transgendered, non-binary, depending on how people identify. But something that was of interest to me was kind of understanding it's like a visual attraction versus a sexual attraction, completely different things. Like you can be visually attracted to someone, like someone just might look good to you, um, depending on what they present as, but that sexual attraction piece is going to be different. To me, that's the part where that's what you are physically attracted to. That's what you're sexually attracted to. And so I do find it interesting that for visual attraction to men and women, it's pretty high. Um, Sexual attraction to men and women, pretty high again. But there are stark differences. Like your visual attraction to men, there was, oh, my phone's going off. Sorry about that. Visual attraction to men, 5 being the highest, meaning I am extremely visually attracted to men. We kind of see that the sexual attraction, it kind of differs. There's a lot of ones and twos and threes. There's kind of a lot of like maybe some mites. But that was interesting to see as the same thing for the visual attraction compared to the sexual attraction to women. We kind of see this stable baseline, but when it comes to sexual attraction, you kind of start seeing things on either a 1 or 5, meaning not at all or highly sexually attracted. Same with non-binary individuals. What was interesting about this was it seems like the results are pretty similar. There's some slight changes from the visual attraction aspect, but to the sexual attraction, but it's pretty much the same. And then same as the transgendered men and transgendered men, as well as visual attraction to sexual attraction, results are kind of the same. There's no outlying factors. There's nothing too prevailing where it's like, oh, that's interesting. But something I did find interesting was the visual attraction to transgendered women, vastly different than the sexual attraction to transgendered women. And so that's the thing that I kind of enjoyed watching it or kind of reviewing. And it doesn't make it wrong or right or good, bad, or indifferent. It just means that you can be visually attracted to how someone looks, as how they present. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a sexual attraction to that individual. So I think the biggest stark difference was the visual attraction to transgendered women versus the sexual attraction to transgendered women. Visual attractions kind of all across the board. 1 was not very attracted at all visually, 5 being very visually attracted. Kind of see that sprinkled. As far as the sexual attraction, not sexually attracted at all, skyrocketed in that dimension. And so I do find that interesting because even though people identify as a particular sexual orientation or a particular gender identity, it doesn't mean that they just fit into one box and this is what they like and this is what they should like and this is what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so when thinking about past research, this right here kind of showcases why sexuality is ever changing, ever evolving, why it is so fluid, depending on the individual and depending on the person that's being asked the question. So I think with past research, that's why it's been so difficult to be able just to put a singular definition on sexuality. Because again, as we see with some of these beginning results, is it's always shifting, it's always changing. It's going to change depending on the question that is being asked, as well as depending on the person that's being asked the question. And so I think I want to go back though, because I don't think I didn't include that. Okay. And so to better understand, I'm going to move this around, to better understand oops. There we go. To better understand some of the results that I gathered, how do you feel about your gender identity? How do you feel about your sexual orientation? How open are you about your sexual orientation? And so how do you feel about your gender identity as well as your sexual orientation? Very positive and positive results. Again, a lot of my sample was, if I recall, is like 60 something percent. A lot of them identified as heterosexual. And so to me, there's no real societal pressure to identify as heterosexual or straight. There are societal norms. I want to make that clear. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of pressure as someone who identifies straight. But I am a little surprised for the people who did not identify as that felt comfortable or confident, or I will rephrase the question or statement, felt positive about their gender identity and their sexual orientation. What was interesting is how open are you about your sexual orientation or gender identity? That was kind of a one-off question. I wasn't expecting anyone to say not open at all. So I'm not really surprised that no one answered that. I know if this was a study maybe done in the early 2000s, maybe the 90s, I could see that number skyrocketing. And so that'd be something great to compare to past research of how open people were in 2024 compared to maybe early 2000s, 1990s. Um, but people seem to be extremely open or very open, with one individual for 7.7, I should say, being slightly open. Um, to me, that showcases that being comfortable about your sexual orientation or gender identity in these different areas in your life, it is something that is important to individuals. And again, how important is your sexual orientation or gender identity to your overall sense of self? To what extent do you feel your sexual orientation or gender identity has influenced your understanding of intimacy and relationships? What was interesting for how important is your sexual orientation to your overall sense of identity? 15.4% said not important at all. And so to me, what that states is gender identity really doesn't define who a person is. That could be good, or bad, so positive or negative, I should say, um, depending on if that is part of your identity and what you bring to the table. Should it matter to your overall sense of self? Um, what I would like to say, I want to wait till I get to the results, but these definitely are thought-provoking questions, that I think begin to scratch the surface, of how people identify or how people feel. But I think uncovering some of the whys, some of the more insight-provoking questions, could be a little more beneficial in future research, but I'll get to that later. Um, and also, to what extent do you feel your sexual orientation or gender identity has influenced your understanding of relationships? Um, Moderately influential, extremely influential. That was kind of what I was looking for. Even the very influential, I think for individuals, I think sexual orientation or gender identity um, can influence how people view their relationships, their most intimate relationships, depending on what's happened in their life. How does that shape? How does that mold? How does that change throughout someone's life? And so, again, these questions kind of begin to scratch the surface, um, of what we begin to understand sexuality is. Oops. For this, how do you feel society views your sexual orientation and or gender identity? Um, 30.8% said very positively, 7.7% said very negatively, and 23% said negatively. And so something that I would have wanted to include for future studies would be understanding what societal factors, do you feel are viewed negatively? And so again, these are questions where we begin to kind of uncover and scratch at the surface, but past understanding that, um, I'm not really getting any information, right? I think it's great to know that society, might have different viewpoints of sexual orientation or gender identities, but I would want to get a little more information into the why do people feel like that, as well as to what extent do people feel pressure to conform to societal norms. About half of my sample said moderately pressured, and so to me, actually, I want to say moderately pressured, extremely pressured, and very pressured. That's about 60, 70%. So about 70% of my sample, felt pressure to fall into this societal norm, this societal box that says if you identify as this is how you should behave, this is how you should act, this is how you should, etc. And so I find that interesting. Again, scratching the surface, a question that I would want more understanding on, more insight on, and more depth on. Oops. And then, do you feel your sexual orientation or gender identity has influenced your mental health and well-being? Um, Half of my sample said that it didn't really influence their mental health. The other half said it has. Um, and to me, I find that to be of one of the things of utmost importance. Why is it that half the people don't feel that their orientation or gender identity has influenced their mental health while the other half have? And so I think, again, this is allowing me to have great insight into kind of beginning to scratch the surface, but definitely I would love to hear I would love to see some responses from follow-up questions. Mm. It is a lot on this slide, but they were all just yes and no questions. And so I kind of wanted to keep them all together. But do you feel your gender identity is portrayed appropriately in the media? Way more than half, about 80, oh, I apologize, about 69% said no. Have people experienced discrimination or stigma based on their sexual orientation or gender identity? Um, More than half people said no. And so those are two nuances that kind of don't really match up, right? If people say that their gender identity or sexual orientation is not portrayed appropriately in the media, um, why do they feel like they've never faced stigma or discrimination? Um, Something that I know where stigmas can stem from is this misportrayal in the media. And so I found that very interesting. Have you encountered challenges in expressing your sexual orientation or gender identity in your professional life or personal life? Um, More than half said no, a little less than half said yes. And so pretty much the results are kind of this is like the most even kill result here. And so I find that to be important because I think does it matter to some people in a personal or professional setting that their first identity is their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So that was very interesting and eye-opening. Do you feel like your sexual orientation or gender identity has influenced your spiritual or religious beliefs? 61% said no, 38% said yes. And so again, I think with the sample that I had, again, a lot of heterosexuals that did my study. And so I could see why some of these results are a little skewed. Um, Especially those who don't identify as heterosexual who come from religious backgrounds, there might be a change in that response. I wouldn't know until I gather that data, but I could see there being a response, or I would hypothesize that there would be a different response that sexual orientation would influence someone's spiritual or religious beliefs. And have you ever sought counseling or therapy related to your sexual orientation or gender identity? Um, about 85% said no, 15% said yes. And so to me, that showcases that people are comfortable, right? A majority of the people are comfortable. But what I found interesting is, again, with that result, if we go back, if I can find it, the mental health question. So about half of the people said sexual orientation, gender identity did not influence their mental health. And so to me, that would make sense. If more than half the people are saying it has not affected my mental health, then I could see why 85% of the people have said, I don't need counseling or haven't needed therapy in regards to my sexual orientation or gender identity. And then I have some questions. To what extent do you agree with the statement? Society understands and accepts diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. Um, 38 were neutral, 38 disagreed, and then the other 23 or 22% agreed. Um, and so I kind of like that result, because to me, it's understanding if we're not just looking at ourselves in our own lens, if we had to look at a societal factor, how do we think that society understands our orientations, our gender identities, or how accepting are they of our gender identities, our sexual orientations? And then the follow-up question to that was, how optimistic are you about the future regarding acceptance and understanding a diverse sexual orientation and gender identities? And so 38 were neutral, but about the other half were optimistic or very optimistic. And so, again, I think if I'm looking at studies that maybe were done in the 90s, early 2000s, even 80s, 70s, I could see this number being completely different. But where we are in the society today is, even though there are some struggles, even though there are huge milestones that we still need to reach, I think there is hope, right? We begin to see a corner turn, right? We begin to see society turn. And even going back to some of the earlier questions that I've asked about, visual attraction to men, to women, to non-binary, to transgendered men, to transgendered women. Oops, I'll go back to that. I think in past studies, maybe those aren't terms that were included in research. And so to be able to include just that terminology in research today, is another key factor into kind of having insight into the hope, that, yeah, there are going to be times where hopefully in the future there is more radical acceptance of how people identify, whether it's their sexual orientation, their gender identity. But I do like that even though people don't necessarily feel that society understands that today, that there is still hope, for the future. That sounds very political. Um, from my conclusions, I was kind of expecting, and so if I kind of gathered and rallied this information together, it seems like people have a general okayness with their life satisfaction. That wasn't a specific question that I asked. Kind of just gaining and taking in the results, I can begin to see, okay, does it look like things are skewing a little more negatively or a little more positively? To me, they skewed more positively than negatively. I wouldn't say all the way, but it was a little more positive, in the grand scheme of things. And so I was actually expecting individuals to have a lower life satisfaction, concerning the societal factors to their sexuality. And I actually learned that people seem to be comfortable when they understand who they are and their own sexuality. But even though individuals are comfortable with their sexuality, it seems like there is still some experience negative societal factors. And even though there are some negative societal factors, there's still hope that in the future, people's mindsets will change, or people will begin to educate themselves more. People will begin to just maybe have a better understanding of what people bring to the table, of who they truly are, their most authentic self. Um, Moving forward, if I were to ever do this study again, something I would want to improve is asking, what discriminations, challenges, or stigmas people have faced to better understand what could affect overall life satisfaction. And so, again, with a lot of the questions that I asked, I think it began just scratching the surface. And I think in the time of doing the study, um, they are very appropriate questions. But after reviewing the results, and seeing how people were answered, I did have those thoughts of, well, I wonder how people experience that, or I wonder why people wrote that down or clicked the button for this, in this case of the online survey, or why did people answer the way that they did. And so I can see the importance of research, because I think from my lens of being a student, I would say, and that's how a lot of research goes, right? But I would say, we ask the questions, and then when we review the results, we begin to understand how can this change, or what could I drastically change just to make this better? What could I drastically change to gather more information? Um, Even though something else I would say is, even though this was for our SciU 528 class, our research methods class, I think having a more diverse group would be beneficial to the overall study. Um, of course, that was kind of a main limitation given with what I was working with, and as far as what we were all working with, just having a class of, I think, about 20 to 25 people. I believe it's that number. But of course, in any research, I would want a broader sample, a more diverse sample. I would still want people who identify as heterosexual, because that was a majority of my survey. I would still, hopefully want people to be included, straight individuals to be included in my survey. Um, but I want a little more diversity, just a little bit more. Also, it leans heavily female, right? And so again, these aren't things that we can control, but I think if I did like a randomized control study, where I had an equal amount of people, um, and just kind of doled out random numbers, or I don't want to say doled out random numbers, but if I had an equal amount of people, but I knew going into this, okay, I want this amount of men, this amount of women, this amount of this type of person, this amount of that type of person. Um, I think that would give me a better sample. And overall, I think getting a basic understanding of individual sexuality is a great start. Um, Again, questions gathered from, or research gathered from the questions that I asked, great start, but I would want to dive further into understanding why people answered the way they did, and how that would guide um, the participants to have more insight into understanding how they perceive their sexuality and maybe overall life satisfaction. And so application, for the clinical application, I go back to one of the literature reviews, but applying this in a clinical setting is understanding that sexuality, it's multifaceted, it's fluid, it's ever changing, and it's ever evolving. To better understand sexuality, I think we have to understand someone's biopsychosocial factors. Excuse me. And then once their biopsychosocial social factors are understood, we can then begin to uncover how people feel and identify with their sexuality. And so in a clinical practice, someone tells me they're homosexual or they're gay, I have an understanding of what that is, but I need to understand it from their lens, from their perspective, from their point of view. If I go into it with, well, this is my definition, I might be missing out on something, or I might be missing their experience, or I might be missing, what they bring to the table. And so studying sexuality, if I'm very honest, I thought it was going to be more fun in the beginning. I don't know where I was going to plan to go with this, but what has made it more difficult is just, again, that piece of understanding that it is constantly changing depending on who you're talking to. And so, in a clinical setting, I think that's just of key importance. If someone identifies as a particular gender identity or sexual orientation, it is best to ask them through their own psychosocial lens what that means to them, instead of me as a therapist going into it with an already predetermined definition and then just putting someone in a box. And so, being very mindful of that. And then once we understand that, I think then we can begin to provoke questions and dig deeper, once those topics or definitions are understood. Um, Something that I would say is, again, can it be difficult to keep track of hundreds and hundreds and thousands of ways that people identify, or I want to rephrase that, define their sexuality? 100%. And so I think another topic that could be studied maybe in the future is maybe gathering people's definitions, right? And somehow doing a study around that. I have no idea what that would look like, but it's something that literally um, just popped into my mind. But there has to be a way to kind of fine tune this overall definition. There might be, right? Future research might be able to do that one day. It's nothing that I will tackle in this very moment, but again, it's just something that popped into my mind. Ooh, and then these are the references, and that was it. So even though it's a little tricky, I had a fun time doing this assignment, doing this activity, putting everything together. I could see why research is important in the psychological field, right? It's to gain that better understanding of a population, right? And to better understand that population, we're just studying the sample. But this was fun, you know. I had a really good time, and I hope whoever watches this, I hope you enjoy what I had to offer. Thank you.